I'm Greg David. I run the Business and Economics Reporting Program at the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, and I write for TheCity. You know, the Great Recession was the worst downturn since the Great Depression nationally, but not in New York City, where it was our shortest and shallowest downturn of the post-war era. We lost only 130,000 jobs. Why? Because our tourism industry continued to be enormously robust, because our banks were bailed out, and because the city's economy was pretty diversified. You know, after the terrorist attacks in 2001, there was another downturn. This one actually wasn't caused by the terrorist attacks, but by the dot-com crash. But even then, it lasted a little less than 2 years, and 225,000 jobs were lost. But there's a story that I have often written about with David Dinkins, who won election in November of 1989. And a month later, he and his advisor, Doug Musio, went up to Columbia to meet with the head of the Citizens Budget Commission. And the head of the Citizens Budget Commission said, "You are going to be sorry that you won." And indeed, New York City went into a very steep recession that lasted from October 1989 to October 1993, and the job loss was even greater, 327,000 jobs. But then there was the real Great Recession in New York, which lasted from 1969 to 1977. The city lost 620,000 jobs. 400,000 of them were in manufacturing. The longest downturn since the Great Depression, in some ways rivaling the Great Depression for length. 800,000 people left the city, and our population declined. How does the pandemic recession compare with that? As of today, the city has lost 600,000 jobs, in a decline more precipitous than any we have seen. The economy has indeed stalled again, because after recovering somewhat from April, we had job losses in December. And new stats I saw just on Monday from the city controller's office says that small businesses in New York are facing ever more difficulty. This is a different recession too than any we've gone through and any that I have covered. If you have a white-collar job and you can work remotely, you are fine. As a matter of fact, in some ways, financially, you are better off. You're saving money on commuting and dry cleaning. You're not spending it in restaurants. That's why city and state tax revenues have been surprisingly on the upside, combined with the fact that Wall Street is doing great again. But if you worked in tourism, or you work in restaurants, or you work in entertainment, you are in serious trouble. And because those industries have been hit hardest, that means the downturn has hurt people of color and women most of all, and women of color even more than the rest. Here's the great irony. Over decades, the city desperately wanted to diversify its economy away from Wall Street. We did that. We did that by creating this enormous tourism industry. We did this by expanding higher education, and we did it by creating a tech sector. But those very strengths have become the key weaknesses in the city. That's why New York City's unemployment rate is almost twice that of the nation. And that's why, at the moment, the prospects for recovery are less bright here than elsewhere. The consequences of all this are what we are here to talk about tonight with my J-School colleague and New York One anchor, Errol Lewis, and 4 people who are on the front lines of this pandemic recession, all of whom, by the way, have figured prominently in my recent coverage for TheCity, and that's why they're here. Oh, that's TheCity all caps, not TheCity lower case, by the way. Errol, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Greg. I'm Errol Lewis, the political anchor at Spectrum News New York One, and an adjunct professor at the Newmark School of Journalism's Urban Reporting program. It happens that we're not just recovering from the pandemic, but we're in the thick of a campaign for mayor, controller, and other municipal offices for which an estimated 200 to 300 candidates are currently competing. The candidates are laying out their plans and their programs for everything from business development and education to public safety and transportation. And at this crucial moment, the candidates are still relatively open to new ideas and perspectives. There's never a bad time to talk about issues that matter, like how to recover from this pandemic, but this is an especially good time for tonight's discussion. We have four great panelists tonight. Natasha Amott is the owner of Whisk, a kitchenware small business that she founded in 2008. She is also an advocate and is passionate about advocating for a greater small business presence in building the local economy. Lisa David is the president and CEO of Public Health Solutions, which supports vulnerable families by partnering with government agencies to support over 200 community-based organizations around the city. They also conduct independent research to evaluate the impact of various programs. Errol is co-CEO and principal of GFP Real Estate, which owns or manages 60 properties around the city, some of them quite important and very large. Eric oversees all aspects of company operations with a focus on leasing and management of the existing portfolio. And Eileen Torres is the executive director of Bronx Works, which serves 60,000 residents of the Bronx that get services. And prior to supervising that organization's 900 employees, she was general counsel of Bronx Works. So she has a legal perspective as well. So now here's the format of tonight's discussion. I'm going to talk with each of the panelists one-on-one for a few minutes, and then we'll have a broader conversation that includes all of the panelists. And all along the way, you can add your thoughts and your questions in the chat box. Use the button at the bottom center of your screen. At about 6:45 or so, we're going to focus on audience questions, and we should wrap things up around 7 o'clock or perhaps a little bit later. And with that, let's get started. Let's start with you, Natasha Amott. Tell us how small businesses are faring as we head into year 2 of the pandemic and start trying to organize some kind of a recovery.
Yeah, well, thank you, Errol, and I'm just so honored to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. So when I'm thinking about this question, Errol, I was thinking about all the conversations I've had over the last year with so many small business owners, and I've landed on 3 big challenging questions that I think should be on all of our minds, and certainly that of any mayoral candidate. And the first is this: how do small businesses meet the financial obligations of commercial leases? A very straightforward question, but in this pandemic, it is an understatement to say that the government silence at all levels on the question of how to pay rent is shocking. The Brooklyn Chamber found that for the month of November, 8 months after New York's pause order went into effect, only 48% of businesses reported paying full rent, 31% paid nothing, and 48% reported owing back rent still. So the reality is that very few small businesses in New York City are finding their way ahead. I don't know if you guys remember, but the New York Times reported last summer that small businesses in majority Black neighborhoods had less than 2 weeks cash reserve on hand. You may have also read that beloved restaurant Prune in the Lower East Side, she closed down soon after the pause order went into effect. She had just enough cash to pay sales tax and 1 week's severance pay to staff. But all the while, for about 6 months now, sitting in Albany is a very smart rent relief bill that many small businesses want to see pass. Very simply, the bill, which we call the Save Our Storefronts bill, sees the landlord waiving 20% of the rent, the tenant pays 1/3 of the lease or 20% of the revenue, whichever's less, and then the state makes up the difference. The sticking point is that it needs federal funding and it can't come soon enough. But figuring out the rent question now is only half the answer to this question. I think the other half is whether or not this virus cures our old worries over high rents. And for me, the question should never be, are the rents coming down? It's, are they affordable? And so, for example, in retail, the industry standard is to spend no more than 10% of your revenue on rent and real estate taxes. I've had 3 Whisks in 2 boroughs, 3 neighborhoods, and I can't get to 10%. And I've had to walk away from my stores when the rent and taxes moved to levels of 18% and much higher. So what do we do? One, I think we need to stop the loss of property taxes that go away to developer subsidies. I think it's on the order of something like $1.5 billion annually. And we need to think about, well, how do we invest that in some form of small business tax credit? Two, I think we need some standard lease improvements. I'm a big advocate for one lease, one number, meaning that there's no unpredictable pass-throughs, which is a commonality of commercial leases. Property taxes are the main thing I'm targeting here. They're way too wild and unpredictable. And then we need to make it easier to exit a lease early. We want to have good guy clauses, no big strings attached, which limit your personal liability. I'd love to see more city leadership around any and all opportunities for community land trusts, which essentially means more nonprofit landlords. And then finally, I think we need to do better on zoning. We should enforce mitigation against commercial displacement when we have rezonings, and we should look at our zoning rules. San Francisco has one in place that successfully keeps out chain stores beyond the downtown core. So this leads me to my second challenging question, Errol. Right now, nationally and in New York City, we're seeing two opposing trends. In the city alone, between March and November of last year, online sales increased by 72%. But since 1983, the number of new businesses starting each year has shrunk by almost 2/3. And in New York City, Black business ownership is only about 2%. So the question for me is, how do we build an economy that allows for digital trade, but still respects the strengths of brick and mortar? I absolutely believe that small businesses have to be online, but I can tell you that the labor, the freight, the higher credit card transaction fees for selling online are far greater than when we sell in store. So we can't replace in-store revenues with lower margin online revenues and pay brick and mortar rents. Not to mention the fact that free freight has to be one of the biggest injuries we've served on the environment. But I think here's what's even more important to me right now. Our city is not having a great conversation on digital trade versus brick and mortar because it's overlooking the kinds of entry-level jobs we're creating and how we attach value to labor. So what do I mean? Well, if we look at online selling for retail or for food delivery via Seamless or an Instacart, it requires entry-level, lower-wage jobs focused on delivery and warehouse picking and packing. So if we see a shift in how a product gets delivered from a store or a warehouse to the consumer as a shift away from customer service associate jobs where an employee works for one employer towards a lot of biking, driving, and routinized picking, packing jobs where individuals are contractors, I think we're creating jobs with lower chances of upward mobility. And at the same time, I think online selling has pushed a consumer-first mentality that prizes the lowest price points. So there are so many kitchen items at Whisk that I can't sell above a 30% margin. Gabrielle Hamilton from the restaurant Prune, she wrote that there's no way her customers would have paid $28 for a Bloody Mary, despite the reality that it may have been worth that when all the expenses to run that restaurant were considered. So I think in this city, it's a critical conversation we have to have right now when we think about what it means to be a city in recovery. It's an awkward conversation often to talk about jobs and kinds of jobs, and it's hazy, but they certainly help to underscore why everything I just laid out on commercial leases is so important. And then here's my final thought, my final challenging question, which is how do the voices of small businesses get heard? I will say that small business owners, we don't have a lot of women or manpower to do advocacy. We're working long hours running the business. And yet in the work I've been doing on the shared rent relief bill I mentioned, in this time when the pain of financial ruin is so obvious, right? It's all around us. Politicians have still been asking small businesses to do the organizing, the rallying, the writing, the pleading, the very same people who are barely treading water. So I think we need to create seats for small business owners on existing city and state small business committees. And we need to revamp our city's Department of Small Business Services, SBS. To no fault of its own, SBS is a technical service agency, and that's needed. But we will not be as successful as we need to be until this agency is empowered to get out of the weeds and act as a policy center as well. And so, Errol, I'll end on this thought. And it's really a plea to anyone running for office this year, get rid of the term mom and pop right away. Because what do you picture? Quaint, simple, older business owners to take pity on, entities to do something for rather than entities to engage with, entities perhaps destined to fail in this new digital economy. But the small business owners I know are tenacious, they're innovators, they respect their employees. And so if we can just think about how small businesses define our local economy, I think we'll do better in thinking about how to support them.
Okay. Natasha, where do not the partnership of New York City, that's a very large organization for very large organizations, but the chambers of commerce, the merchant associations, the business improvement districts,
Yeah.
are they relevant to this discussion, do you think, from the standpoint of providing advocacy for small businesses like yours?
They are absolutely relevant. You know, I would say I've worked personally quite a bit with both the Brooklyn and the Manhattan chambers. They are wonderful partners. The Brooklyn Chamber has done a tremendous amount of good data research, which we really need to understand the path forward. The bids, absolutely, they do wonderful service. I have, I guess, the equivalent of a merchants association in my little area, which is supportive at promoting. But what I would say is, I guess, two things. One, the bids in the merchant associations, which are often supported by the landlords themselves, are not necessarily having boards that are run by, first and foremost, the small businesses. And they're not policy places, right? The chambers, you get closer to policy, but even when it comes to, let's say, the shared rent relief bill, the one that I was mentioning that's been sitting in Albany for 6 months, we've had very little support from the chambers to take this action upon themselves to say, we believe in this bill, we believe it's a good bill, and to fight for it. So I feel like there is a bit of a disconnect between what small businesses want and then how we get the resources from the chambers at times.
Okay. We'll come back, I'm sure, to some of those issues. And Lisa, David, I wanted to bring you into this. We know that social service organizations, which are in small businesses that have a different tax structure, ultimately, we know that they've had a hard time keeping the doors open, even in a good year. What are the major challenges in operating during the pandemic and trying to see our way through to a recovery?
Well, I'm going to have some recommendations, but I just want to focus on the fact as we shift from businesses to the communities that have been most affected, that this virus has really escalated and elevated the kinds of inequities and social justice issues that existed long before the pandemic. But these are our clients. We're providing access to food and nutrition, maternal health, early childhood development, reproductive health, and sexual and reproductive health. And our communities, low-income, immigrant, marginalized communities, have been dramatically affected more than others in New York City. They've been getting infected and they have been dying in multiple rates compared to the rest of the city. And they have been losing their jobs or losing hours compared to the rest of the city. We've done several surveys, 2 surveys since COVID happened. And not only have 24% of Black and Hispanic low-income residents that we speak to have lost their jobs and lost health insurance as a result. And twice as many Black and Hispanic New York City residents have had no COVID testing as white residents. So we don't have those data on vaccines yet, but we have seen the public data from vaccines, and these communities just aren't getting the help that they needed, and they were behind the 8 ball as this started. Another group I want to call out are seniors. They have been extraordinarily isolated because of the pandemic, and we made a big shift towards remote services, and the problem is that 3 times as many seniors do not have access to technology or internet services as other residents of New York City. So their ability to get access to services is extraordinarily diminished, and that's something we've been working on, but it's a huge issue. It's also affected families with children in low-income communities trying to do their schooling, but the seniors are hugely impacted. So it has been really challenging. The first areas of cuts when the financial situation gets dire is always public health, social services. And so PHS, along with all of the other community-based organizations, have seen withholding last year and cuts coming up of funding. So the state and city have not been paying the full bills, and we're looking at budget cuts. And there's been huge delays in registering contracts and actually paying invoices, which is starving these organizations of the cash flow that they need. And believe you me, we have no reserves to cover us. And so as I look forward to what it'll take, and I think COVID has raised issues around our social safety net in a way that hasn't been raised before, and that we really need to capitalize on to make a stronger situation as we move forward with this pandemic and for the next and for life in general, is we need to build a real public health infrastructure. The federal government, the state and city governments have funded an enormous amount of money towards hospitals to invest in technology, to expand their networks. Our country, our state, our city are totally focused on hospital and health care, but that's not health. And the problem is the public health safety net is 15,000 organizations in New York City, largely underfunded, trying to do the best they can. And we really need to create an infrastructure that can integrate that across the kind of scope of services that are provided, and will also integrate it back to healthcare organizations and insurance companies. So one thing we need to look at is completely redesigning and reinventing the procurement process, which leaves out really small organizations who can't file these really complex RFPs, and that just pay for the services, the cost of services. Construction companies aren't asked to like raise money to support their projects, but not-for-profits are. So we need to get real payment for the services that we provide, and we need to pay living wages. I have staff who are eligible for the benefits they're administering. That's unconscionable. We're not paying living wages because I'm not getting reimbursed in my grants in order to allow that to happen. We need to make the kind of investment that was made in hospital technology in that public health infrastructure, both to enable our organizations to share information and so that we know what's happening. I make a referral and I generally don't know what's happening. I need to have that information back, and we need to be able to share that with the managed care and the hospital organizations. And you look at what's happening with testing, with vaccines. We have this enormous community resources in the community-based organizations, and they're not being used. They speak the languages of the community. They are trusted by the community. And we're only providing vaccines to hospital, mass vaccination centers. It doesn't make any sense. So why is it surprising that such a small proportion of these communities, people of color, marginalized communities, aren't getting vaccinated? It's not only because of vaccine hesitancy. They don't have access, and they're not being educated in their own languages.
Okay, so now
that's it. I have more. You can come back.
No. I want you to continue, but I was under the impression, maybe I missed something as we were trying to cover the height of the pandemic, but during the phase when people would come out and clap for the first responders and the frontline health workers and so forth, what I remember day after day was that the city or the state would announce a program with no dollar figure attached to it. The mayor would stand up and say, we're going to feed 2 million people a day because we have to. The governor would say, we're going to get masks, to and ventilators to every corner of the state with no price tag attached to it. Was that not extended to the 15,000 organizations that you're talking about as our de facto public health infrastructure?
So in actual fact, we organized referrals to the New York City Get Food. Was I paid for it? No. We accumulated donated PPE that we provided to other not-for-profit organizations. Was I paid for that work? No. So yes, the city stood up services, and it relies to the extent that we volunteer to do it, to contribute to that work, but they're not using that. We stepped up, we weren't asked to do it. So there's this structure that actually relates to the communities most in need that never gets used. And it's complicated because it's a large number of organizations. It's much easier to go to Walgreens.
Right.
And I'm not saying we shouldn't go to Walgreens, but, and that's why I think this infrastructure needs to be developed, because people don't trust the city. They don't trust government. People of color don't often trust the healthcare system. So it's an infrastructure that the components exist for that needs to get built. So yes, were we involved? Yes, but most of us just stood up and volunteered and got no reimbursement for that whatsoever.
The procurement question you reference, I have, over the last several decades, gone to countless press conferences and heard promises from Controller Stringer and Controller Thompson and Controller Liu and every controller for the last generation, saying that they were going to streamline procurement. And I just moderated a debate the other day, and there's a whole new crop of controller candidates who swear that they're going to fix this. What do they need to actually do as opposed to promise?
So what they've promised is prompt payment and efficient registration of contracts. They have not changed anything in the system. And by the way, that hasn't happened. And by the way, during COVID, it's gotten really worse, significantly worse. So I think it's not a function of speeding up the existing system. It's a function of redesigning it and making it much less complicated. Government contracting systems are completely designed. The only thing on their mind is we have to avoid fraud.
Right.
It's not we have to produce outcomes. So I just think we need to reinvent procurement. They just keep adding layers on top of it. We need to take that away and redesign it. And I would have a lot of ideas on that. But, and let's make this performance-based. Let's give people a reasonable amount of contract time without them going through the entire contract process every year. Let's actually pay them their rates and pay them on time. All that we've seen from all of these administrative changes is they think they can reduce the amount of months that it would take to get this work done, but they haven't changed the work that has to happen or the mindset of what happens.
Okay. Let me shift now to Errol. The real estate market, the commercial real estate market has been turned upside down. I remember interviewing folks telling me about the shocking idea that $1 billion property like the New York Hilton was sitting vacant. Other comparably valuable properties operating at a fraction of their capacity. What is from your point of view, a realistic recovery scenario? There's a lot of talk about repurposing parts of the market and certain kind of zoning changes, but that strikes me as kind of a surface observation from the outside. From the inside, what do we need to do?
Well, I think you're right about that observation. And if we can't continue to create jobs, as Greg talked about at the beginning in New York City, why are we going to create more housing? Right? People want to live here because they work here, not because they work somewhere else. So I think that piece of it seems a little curious for me. I think, look, a lot of these things are really straightforward, and you hear about them all the time. The people need childcare to go to work, right? So opening schools is a paramount thing that we should definitely focus on. People are going to want to feel that it's safe, right? I think there's very easy and obvious sort of quality of life issues that need to be resolved in New York City that are sort of bring the commercial business back. Otherwise the infrastructure pieces are still here. As now people get so focused on, hey, is everyone going to come back to work 5 days a week? Or are we going to work remotely the whole time? Is it going to be some sort of hybrid model? And in New York, there's so many capable people in New York. All these things will be tried, and all these things will be successful to a certain extent. But the reality is, if you have a business in New York and you're headquartered in New York, and if you're going to have a hybrid model, think about where the people can live and still access that office space relatively easily. You can draw a circle around Manhattan, and it gives a ton of options for where your people want to work. Where if you move those offices, to a specific part of New York, say, I'm in Westchester, say in Long Island, but you really limit where your people can be, and that's going to make it harder for you to find the talent that New York is so good at sort of achieving. So I think, look, it's going to take some time. We all understand that. We're all trying to be really patient to the extent that we can be patient. We understand the concerns that our tenants have. We appreciate the technology that's allowing them to basically work from home. I mean, imagine if that didn't exist. Imagine if this happened 30 years ago, where we couldn't have a call like this, where we can see each other and hear each other and it's so clear. What would have happened then if you really couldn't come to work at all? That would have been much worse than what we have today. I mean, thank God for the technology that we have, which is allowing us to sort of achieve what we're able to achieve, obviously in a limited scale, but still, people are working, just like Greg said in the beginning.
To the extent that it won't, in parts of the Midtown core, it won't be realistic to expect 7,000 people to come into the building, in and out every day. What would that mean, both for the real estate industry and, more importantly, for those neighborhoods, for those communities?
Yeah, it's going to obviously have a big impact, right? So obviously, look, if there's less jobs and less people need office space, right? Demand goes down, supply stays the same, and prices are going to go down. So that's going to hurt, obviously the values, the amount of money and the tax base that New York City has and able to achieve from real estate. So I think that's going to be a struggle. It's going to hurt small businesses and large businesses on a retail basis because they need foot traffic and people to come here. We sort of talk about it all the time. Like, as you start to think how New York has evolved over the last 10 years, what you're seeing is a lot of the restaurant business has sort of moved into areas where the rents are a little bit less because they're more destination places, right? We've seen that. The kind of restaurants you see sort of in Times Square are not the kind of restaurants you necessarily see around the rest of Manhattan. Because what Greg said in the beginning is true. That's a tourist-based economy, and that's not necessarily a Manhattan-based economy. So if the tourism piece comes back, what we've seen over the last probably even 15 years is areas where the tourism is rising, the commercial sort of interest of native New Yorkers is going down. So you're seeing the big push in the last, with the tech companies is all Midtown South, right, which are not tourist-based places. You're seeing residentially, some of the most expensive sort of zip codes in New York City are Tribeca, right, which is not a tourist place. So it seems like New Yorkers are sort of having this sort of reverse reaction to the areas that tourists are so interested in. We always sort of joke about it. When a tourist comes to town, what's the first place they want to go? And it's Times Square. And when a New Yorker comes back from vacation, where's the last place they want to go? And it's Times Square.
Very true. Very true. As an operator, from the standpoint of your business, what have you been able to do for your tenants? To the extent that they're dealing with the kind of problems and challenges that Natasha was talking about.
Sure. So, Natasha makes a lot of good points. We've been basically going back to sort of that percentage rent idea that Natasha talked about and saying to definitely all the restaurant tenants, hey, look, whatever you guys are making, you're going to give us, somewhere between 10 and 12% of whatever that is. And we'll just have to accept it. And that's the best we can do. Look, we're not trying to put anybody out of business. We don't want them to put us out of business, but we understand sort of how the interconnected, ecosystem works in New York, right? How am I going to convince my office tenants to come back if there's no restaurant for them to eat lunch in, right? And how am I going to convince them to come back if there's not a place they can get coffee, right? How am I going to convince them to come back if there's not a place for them to do some of the other things? A gym, for example, is a good point, right? Doctor's offices, dentists. How are they going to come back if those things aren't open? So they have to work together. So we've had an effort where we work with all the tenants, and you sort of understand that, look, in sort of the fabric of the community, sometimes the stronger people have to hold up the people who are less strong. But, our attitude the whole time has been, we're all going to be a little bit dented, but no one should be left behind. And I think we pretty much achieved that.
Is there any speculative pressure there? In other words, as you said, prices are going to drop on real estate. Is there a pile of money sitting on the side saying, aha, here's my chance to get a little piece of Midtown East?
There's a lot of people who say there's a pile of money sitting around waiting to get their chance in some interesting sort of New York real estate. I can tell you, I got into the business in 91. And in 91, through that sort of recession, there was a lot of that. A lot of new money was able to come in and sort of pick up these buildings that were struggling to pay their debts, even maybe foreclosed on. I can tell you that in sort of the 06, 07, 08 piece of it, or 07, 08, that didn't happen as much. What happened was that those big pile of money, they came in and they partnered with the existing owners. It's like when the Mets sold a piece of the company when they struggled with Madoff. That was sort of the construct that people basically had. So I expect that to happen again.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think of the hotel sector in particular, which has been especially hard hit by all of this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's too bad. That's really unfortunate for all the people who basically did that, and invested in hotels and want to be part of the, a great tourism city. I think repurposing some of the hotels is a better idea than repurposing some of the commercial buildings.
Mm-hmm.
I think those possibilities in terms of sort of how they're built and where they are, I think a lot of those things make a lot more sense. And I think that would help some of the small businesses, right? If you think about the kind of retail businesses that hotels, guests go to, they're probably not going to Natasha's store to buy kitchen items, right? When they've come here from Europe, that's not what they're doing. So if you expanded the amount of people who lived here locally through the hotel conversions, then you could also expand retail businesses, for small businesses like Natasha's.
Right, got it. And then I guess finally, if you were at the start of your career, rather than sort of where you are now, would New York look like a place of opportunity?
In '91, I mean, there was a lot of things in New York that needed to change. So I sort of think so. I think New York has this really great brand outside of New York as being sort of the greatest city in the world. But I think there's a lot of people, especially in the last few years, that have gotten here and started to ask questions whether that's true or not. 91, there was a long way to go. But again, it had a lot of people here who were very capable, very committed, and I think those people sort of got together. One thing that New York has always shown the ability to is we sort of, we know how to sort of get together when things are bad, and we know how to work together. At least we've done that in the past. We have to do that again. Right. So I think in '91, I remember coming here after college and going to work with my family's business, and I remember sitting in my dad's office, and he was getting envelopes in the mail, and it was just the keys to the space. Wow. So he said, well, we got to call these people up and go see them, and we would go down there, and then he would reduce the rent and reduce the space. And after doing that for a couple months, I sort of asked him, I was like, gee, Dad, how do we make money at this? Mm-hmm. And he said, you just got to stick around, and it'll change, and it'll get better. I think that may be true again today.
Okay, that's we ought to turn that into a New York slogan. Just hang around. That's the path to success. Eileen, you and your organization pioneered the idea of housing first, meaning the best way to deal with, the best way to help homeless families is to get them a place to stay first, and then along the way you add in the social services and other supports that they need. Has that changed in the era of COVID? Has it validated your approach? Where do things stand now?
Well, where things stand now, right now, actually, we're not having anyone evicted, right? So on the family side, certainly, what we've had move outs from our family shelters, but what's unfortunate is right now there's been this eviction moratorium. So in that sort of sense, on the family side, things are fine. For the singles, which is where really the housing first model came in, which is the thought is you really house them and then you work on the challenges and the obstacles that got them to the street to begin with, right? And you sort of deal with that once they're stable in their own housing. So we're still placing where we've been fortunate. Those are classified as essential workers. So they've actually been, going into the shelters and working. We were one of the organizations that were forced to relocate our Bronx-based shelter into Manhattan. So wasn't too thrilled about that. But we're still able to place a number of our homeless clients into apartments. So we've been able to do that, yeah.
One of the storylines that came out as we've moved through the pandemic has been that that population of single men in particular has been an issue. Let's just put it that way. It's been a challenge for lots of different organizations in different neighborhoods. There's been a lot of pushback. Department of Homeless Services has said they're doing the best they can to keep things safe for everyone. But that's an emergency response. That's kind of to tide us over for the remaining months, say, of this administration. What comes after that?
Well, we don't know what comes after that. That's part of the problem. So, as a provider, I think Lisa was touching on some of the issues that we see, in particular, working with New York City, and especially with, unfortunately, the Department of Homeless Services. If we're going to think about issues that the next mayor really needs to look at, Lisa touched on, if you want to recover, if New York is going to recover, you need the nonprofits. You need us to provide those critical services that we've been able to provide. We're much more flexible and innovative than the government. That's why they quickly started to divest of all the programs and providing direct services themselves. Even looking at Wi-Fi in our homeless shelters. We were one of the very first providers that we were able to quickly figure out how to get internet into our homeless shelters for families, so we can make sure our students were connected to the internet and not lose out on the fact that they were now in this remote classroom, right? The city's still trying to figure that out with all the other providers. So we are critical to the recovery of New York City. They need to invest in us. They need to fully fund the programs that they want us to operate. So that means that we have a certain infrastructure in our organization and across all the providers. You need human resources, you need fiscal, you need technology. Those are all critical services within an organization. Their support staff, so they really, make the organization run. You need to be able to support those positions in the agency and not really think of ways to come back on providing us with the indirect dollars that we need to operate. When you come up and you think about some of the programs, looking at the homeless services in particular, we shouldn't have to start looking to find private dollars to supplement the services that we're able to provide for our homeless men and women, for our children in our shelters, for our workforce development. They fund the staff that are able to help place people into jobs. They fund the positions to follow up and do the retention, right, so that we can make sure that people are maintained into jobs. But then there isn't enough funding for the actual job training of helping people get the skill they need to be placed into a position that hopefully has a livable wage, so they can sustain themselves. So we're really thinking about what the next mayor has to think about and consider. It's really looking at the nonprofits as a partner, not a vendor, not someone that they dictate things to. It's really the partner that can come up with great solutions, innovative solutions on trying to really provide the services that need to be provided to those most in need.
You're alluding to a practice that I encountered a long time ago when I was a grant writer. It's disturbing to me that it may still be the practice, which is the city determining, what $1's worth of service is, and then telling you, guess what, we're going to give you 80 cents. I mean, right up front, telling you that they're going to underfund you on the assumption that you're going to have a bake sale or something like that to raise the balance. That to me is such a fundamentally unsound practice for any nonprofit. But it's one thing if you do it with a cultural arts grant or something like that, but you're dealing with people's lives. Is there a push or the possibility of an advocacy push to simply end that practice, to pay people $1 for $1's worth of services?
So there's certainly an advocacy push. Are they listening? I don't know. So we've been advocating for them to be able, for the city in particular, and the state. The state is equally guilty of this as well. Of the state and the city to be able to provide funding that allows us to run and operate the full program, right? So not for us to really think through and sort of chase these other dollars to make the program operate and provide comprehensive services that really have a positive impact on the thousands of lives. Like in particular with BronxWorks, we provide services to 64,000 individuals and families a year. but very often we're looking for those supplemental dollars. I see that Greg put in the real fact that food insecurity in the Bronx pre-COVID was extremely high. Now, because of COVID, we can't even keep track of the numbers. But what have we been doing? We've doubled. We were operating 4 food pantries pre-COVID. We started operating 12. How are we able to do that? We went and we started asking for private funding so that we're able to feed all these individuals and their families, right? So I think if we're going to really, really start talking about what is it that this city needs, we need to be able to provide these critical services in a way that helps the nonprofit and keeps the nonprofit really in business, in order to do those, to provide those services. And the way they're operating right now, and the contracts, the delays in the contract registration, those are all causing such a strain on all of the CBOs that I don't know if we'll have all of us, we sit around a room often, together, all of us venting at the very issues. But I don't know if, all of us will be there at the end of the day. I'm not sure if we'll be able to sustain all these nonprofits that really provide. Some of them are much smaller than Bronxers. They really provide also critical services in all the boroughs in New York City.
Right. I want to encourage.
I want to build off of something Eileen said, which was one of my other recommendations that we didn't get to. I think we need to, it's not going to make me popular, but really evaluate what direct services the city government provides, because they're more expensive and they're not accountable. So shelters is one of these issues. Like, why would we have city-run shelters when community-based organizations can do a better job? I mean, the salaries are higher, the benefits are higher, they're fully paid, believe you me, but the community-based organizations doing a better job are not. Mm-hmm. So one of the big issues is, I think government should be setting policy. I think they should be, figuring out what the priorities are in terms of how resources go. But in many areas, not all, there's definitely things government should be doing. They shouldn't be providing direct services. They should be relying on the community organizations to do it, who are more efficient, more accountable. We are held accountable, they are not. It's an issue. And then if they weren't spending that money, it could go back to the community-based organizations to better fund them for the same services.
Okay, a point very well taken. I want to encourage folks to add your questions. I see some that are coming up in the chat. It's the button on the bottom tier in the center of your screen. You can just hop right in and add some. Here's a question from the great Beth Fertig, our journalist and friend. This is a question for everybody. If the only job growth has been among low-wage delivery workers up till now, what's the next step up the ladder for them? What is the industry or industries that they can enter that will pay more, and how can the city help those jobs to grow? That's for anybody.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Natasha.
Well, I was just going to say that, I spoke about this a little bit at the beginning. I think, this is part of the small business conundrum right now, right? So we are facing this increase because of food apps like Seamless and Grubhub, because of websites like Shop in NYC. We're seeing more of these kinds of jobs, right? Delivery workers. I don't think there is a lot of opportunity that I can think of off the top of my head for these kinds of workers, especially if they're working for multiple companies in the sense that they're contractors. They're not just employed by one employer. And I think that's a lot of the issue here. I think if when we look at small business, retail, or services, yes, there's also low wage jobs happening, right? But when you are working for one employer in one setup, and it's in an environment where you can learn more about how to run the website maybe for the company. I've had staff before who I hired them for customer service. I discovered they're amazing artists. They put their art all over the sandwich boards outside and in our windows. They got art contracts as a result of that. I think it's those conversations that happen in the workplace that help find upward mobility for staff. And I don't know if, you know, Eileen and Lisa, through your agencies, maybe Eileen more, you see people coming in that have those jobs. I don't know if you've seen if there is that opportunity to go forward so much with the delivery staff.
Errol, if I can interject here, I think there are two ways to look at this. One of which is making sure New Yorkers are prepared for the economy we have. There is lots of emphasis on preparing New Yorkers for the tech industry, which with Wall Street has emerged from this pandemic unscathed, continues to expand lots of opportunities. But there is definitely an effort in Albany to pass legislation that would make those companies pay living wages. It didn't quite work in California. The California bill was flawed, but you can be sure that there will be strong advocacy this session for some attempt to make sure that if you're a delivery person for Seamless or you work for Uber, that at least you're going to make the minimum wage.
It's also worth pointing out there was an excellent set of stories in TheCity by one of my former students, in part, about the deliveristas, that they are self-organizing, and it's much more complicated than you would think. Some of those pedal assist bikes that they have tricked out so that they can, you know, sit on them for 8 hours at a time can cost a couple of $1,000s, and they need a certain amount of health insurance and other basic supports in order to continue and to move on to whatever is going to come next for them. I had actually a question for I guess this would have to go to Lisa. When it comes, or Eileen, when it comes to the rent supports that the city provides, the vouchers that they provide, which are about $1,300 for singles, up to about $1,700 a month for a family of four. There are a lot of landlords who simply turn it down, who are not accepting it, in part because the amount's too little, in part because there are other biases that are playing out in the system. Is the solution, and should the next mayor simply raise that amount, or are there other things that they should be doing as well?
Eileen?
So in terms of the amounts, my understanding, and again, this is not my day-to-day, is the mayor can't just raise those amounts himself. You know, there has to be sort of done in partnership with the state, right? So, but there are other ways that the city can help. So, you know, we want to talk a little bit about housing and housing security. You know, right now with the moratorium, that's great. They're kind of really kicking the can down the road as to what happens. Because at the point that's lifted, all of the rent that someone owes for all of these months will become due. And so we really need to figure out what happens at that point. How do people pay thousands and thousands of dollars back in rental arrears? They're not going to be able to do that, especially if they still don't have a job. So there's a couple of things that that is a requirement for you to be able to get assistance as you sort of go looking for someone to help you with the rental arrears, right? You have to be able to show that, one, you have a future ability to pay, and that's not going to be the case for the thousands of New Yorkers that are out of a job. So the city can easily really look at trying to waive that requirement. The other thing is you have to have an eviction notice, which really is at this point unnecessary. It just causes both the landlord, some of whom are small landlords that only own, perhaps their own house that's a 3-family house, something they rent out the other apartments. So that forces the landlord to actually have to go and get an attorney to try to file paperwork so they can start an eviction process against someone, right? This is, of course, when things are lifted. So they should be able to waive that requirement. You shouldn't need the eviction. So you should just be able to, at this point, able to come in, show proof that you're not able to pay for all of these months, and be able to then get assistance paying back those rental arrears. So I think there's two quick fixes that they can do. Of course, I'm not sort of in the weeds of this, so to me it seems like a quick fix. But you shouldn't have to come in with an eviction notice, and you should not have to I lost my train right here. You shouldn't have to have the eviction notice, and then you also should not have to be able to show that you have a future ability to pay, because that may not be the case for many others.
Got it. Okay. We've got a question here. What will happen when the eviction moratorium expires?
Well, that's exactly, people need to, the city and the state really need to figure that out now, because you need to be able to figure out how people are going to be able to pay the rental arrears. And as someone who typically likes to, see the tenant always as the person and the individual in the household that you want to help, in this particular situation, I am sympathetic to the landlords as well. They also have mortgages that they have to pay, especially the smaller landlords. So we need to be able to come up with a plan that provides money back to the landlords for the rent that's owed to them, and then of course helps tenants stay in their housing. You don't want to be in a situation where all of a sudden the moratorium is lifted, and now we have thousands upon thousands of homeless families and homeless individuals. That really is going backwards for New York City, especially when we had already a high amount, we were at the highest levels of about more than 60,000 homeless individuals and families. Right. So we don't want to increase that number.
Eric Errol, I know you do commercial real estate, and it's a different animal. But I just always assume that any reliable flow of future income can be discounted, can be lent against, can be securitized, can be subsidized, and that some large version of that is going to be pretty much the only way to avoid a massive wave of evictions and foreclosures. What do you think?
Well, I think when the eviction moratorium is lifted, the noise you're going to hear is going to be lawyers rejoicing. But I think you guys are on top of it. I think, look, the eviction notice and the subsequent potential getting an apartment back is only as meaningful as your ability to replace the tenant. If you don't have the ability to replace the tenant, then what did you do? Right? You didn't really do anything. So as we think about on the commercial side, the restaurants especially, what's the point? Who's opening I should ask Natasha, how many people are dying to open a retail business or a restaurant business these days? It's not a large group, right? So the reality is, like, why am I getting rid of a restaurant if I can't replace that restaurant with somebody else? It doesn't really make any sense. It's confusing to us when we see landlords sort of taking that tack. I'm not sure exactly what they think is going to happen. So I think,
but Eric, they do take that tack. The number of empty retail spaces that had successful businesses that got pushed out with increased rental is huge. I'm not quite sure how that works, but
yeah, no, at least you're right. I think, but pre-COVID that was the case. Now that we're in the COVID situation, I'm saying now it's sort of switched back over. What was happening before in the retail thing, yeah, it was a lot of greed, and a lot of people, by the way, are paying the price for it. Those stores have been vacant for a long time, and like that's not a good thing. And you don't get a tax break, and like all those stories that people told you how it was really a good thing for the landlord, none of that is true. But as far as the apartments go, like, look, I agree. You want to have people who help people, right? You want to have people focus on who their landlords are and what kind of morals they have and what kind of ethics they have and what do they believe in and how do they believe, so the communities work together. And if you hold landlords to that standard, and if you're saying to the landlords, hey, look, I'm not going to rent from you because I hear this is what, then they have to change or they have to get out of the business. If people continue to rent from those people and to continue to give them what they want, you're like encouraging them and you're encouraging bad behavior. One of the negatives now, as far as the real estate people go, is Errol, you probably see this more than anyone, is politically there's a bullseye on us. And to a certain extent, we deserve it, right? We need to hold ourselves to high standards, right? If you have a building somewhere that has 500 violations, that person should be punished. That's how it should be. No one should live in that place in something that's called the greatest city in the world, right? And we need to do a better job at both the real estate community and the city, you know, taking care of that. But at the same time, you need the tenants to push back. You know, it's like, look, when there's a overpriced restaurant in your neighborhood, you don't go. That's the message you send, right? And the same thing should be happening sort of in our business.
Yeah, so if I could just add on to that very quickly, Errol. You know, I think part of the problem here, so I talked with a broker today who covers a lot of the tri-state region, and I asked her, so what's happening? Are deals being made? What do you see? Are small businesses coming back in? Because I don't know any small business that went out of business that's sitting on cash, right? The only people sitting on cash right now are the Shake Shacks, the big multinationals, the international brands. And so those are the ones that I've been fearing are going to come in and take over some of the small business spaces. This broker confirmed that deals are happening. Okay, so there are vacancies, absolutely. There are deals happening, but yeah, it is mostly multinationals. What made me feel nervous is that she was talking about Brooklyn downtown, and she said you're actually seeing some deals happening with multinationals who have not even been present in Manhattan before. These are international businesses, and pre-COVID, they had set their eyes on Brooklyn. And I saw this play out pre-COVID in Williamsburg. You just go to Williamsburg, you document the change there, you understand exactly what this is about. Businesses that are high in private equity to back them. They don't need to make a rent calculation that's specifically about, can I make enough revenue to pay that rent? They just need to make a calculation of, oh, is this a good advertising investment for myself or for the business? And if it is, great, I'm going to do it. And so what my biggest fear is, because I went into this thinking, well, you know, there's no good news in COVID, but maybe rents will really come down and stay down, right? And that's the question, will they stay down? But if we do have businesses like what she was describing coming in, then I worry those rents are not going to go as low as they need to be truly affordable. And just very quick add on to Amanda's comments in the chat about the gig economy workers. I think, you know, I get the point there. What I think I was trying to point out maybe earlier is that when it comes to gig workers, the question is, when we fight against this digital economy versus brick and mortar, it is how much of that gig economy replaces brick and mortar. And when that happens, that's when I think we are losing valuable kinds of entry level jobs.
Natasha, if I could interrupt, I would tell you that in all my years of experience, retail brokers are at the bottom. Resident real estate brokers are at the bottom of my truth scale. Never tell the truth. Never. And we have evidence, by the way, we have lots of evidence to the contrary. We know from the Center for an Urban Future that there's been a major pullback of major chains in New York. The number of chain stores in New York dropped dramatically last year. We have McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts retreating from the city. We know that most big retailers are shuttering their stores. I wouldn't put 2 cents in what that broker told you. I don't think it's true, and I don't think it's likely to be a threat in the near future.
We'll see. I mean, if we're not making deals and then places are sitting empty for a little bit and further push the rents down, great. Then small businesses have their chance.
I have no doubt that's going to happen.
If I would say to anybody, if you want a surreal experience, take a walk through Hudson Yards, where there are stores open where they'll sell you a $10,000 watch, and you can buy a $6 cup of coffee, and the place is a ghost town. You could, you know, Tiffany's is open. They're hoping you'll come in, but you could also, you know, you could play 9 pins. You could go bowling down the middle of some of that place.
I mean, it's very significant that Neiman Marcus broke its lease and left Hudson Yards.
Yeah.
That is what is significant here in terms of what's happening in the marketplace.
So I live in Chelsea and near the meat market. And what's interesting will be, so yes, the chains are, I didn't know this, but if the chains are moving out, that's great. But they already closed down a lot of small businesses. And so the question is, does them moving out create the environment where small businesses can move back? We've lost so many of our neighborhood businesses.
Yes, absolutely.
We're all turning into Times
That
Square.
is one of the great questions facing the city.
Yeah.
Okay, on that note, we're at the end of our time. I really want to thank everybody for participating, and I thank those who were on. I see a lot of friends and experts and others who have been listening in on this. So we hope we'll continue this conversation in a different forum. But for now, I want to thank Natasha Amott and Eric Errol and Lisa David and Eileen Torres for joining me. And thank you, Greg, for pulling all of this together.